The watch market corrected. The hype died. The flippers moved on. And then a strange thing happened. Certain watches started quietly climbing. The ones nobody was talking about. The ones sitting in drawers and weekend bags and forgotten velvet boxes. Not Rolex sports models, not Patek grails. The other ones. The ones you bought because you liked them, or inherited without ceremony, or picked up at a fair price because the price felt right. 7 of them are worth a lot more than you think right now, and I'll show you. 7. The discontinued Cartier that nobody treated as rare. Cartier discontinued the Tank Solo in 2021. The collection was simply replaced by the Tank Must line, and that was that. Most people who owned one barely noticed. That quiet exit was the beginning of a 27% price increase. The Tank Solo reference W5200024. The rose gold quartz ladies piece with the slim profile and cream dial has climbed 27.3% on the secondary market in the 12 months to mid-2025, according to Watch Charts data. That's not a typo. A quartz ladies Cartier. No mechanical movement, no complications, no dramatic backstory. 27% in a year when most of the broader watch market was flat or negative. The reason is almost insultingly simple. Cartier stopped making it. No rose gold tank. Must exists at a comparable size to fill the gap. The closest current alternative, the Tank Lewis Small in Moonshine Gold, costs roughly twice as much and uses a different movement configuration. Buyers looking for the original slim rose gold proposition found they couldn't get it new anymore, so they started paying secondary prices for the old one. That's the whole story. The observation worth sitting with here. Collectors spent years treating the Tank Solo as a lesser tank. Too accessible, too simple, not mechanical enough for serious attention. The same logic that kept prices suppressed is now making supply tight, because most of the people who own them still don't think of them as valuable. They think of them as a watch they wear to lunch. Picture the woman who bought one in 2017 as her first real purchase after a promotion. She's worn it 3 days a week for 8 years. She has no idea it's appreciated by more than a quarter of its original cost since the day she bought it. She wouldn't sell it anyway, but if she knew, she'd hold it differently. The Tank Solo story isn't about one discontinued quartz watch. It's about what happens when Cartier, a brand with deep institutional identity and conservative catalog management, quietly removes something. The absence creates a gap. The gap creates demand. And demand, in a market correcting away from speculation towards sustained long-term value, is exactly what makes a watch appreciate consistently rather than spike and crash. There's also a second tank worth mentioning in the same conversation. The Tank Française reference W51005Q4 from the early 2000s. Also discontinued. Also climbing. The pattern is the same. When Cartier exits a reference without drama, the reference quietly appreciates without drama. Collectors are finally paying attention. One more thing about the Tank Solo that most coverage misses. The rose gold Solo used a quartz movement, and quartz movements get dismissed in collector circles as lesser. But here's what that actually means for someone holding one today. The movement requires almost no maintenance. Battery changes every few years. No service cycle. No dried oils, no worn pivots, no regulation needed. The practical cost of ownership over 15 years is dramatically lower than a mechanical watch at a comparable price. And the object itself is pure Cartier design language, uncompromised, in a reference that no longer exists at retail. The Tank Solo was also one of the last references Cartier produced in rose gold at a proportionally slim size before the Must line shifted the aesthetic. The Must runs wider, carries a different bracelet character, and targets a slightly different buyer. So the Solo isn't just a discontinued watch. It's the last version of a specific combination of material, proportion, and movement configuration that Cartier hasn't revisited. That gap matters to the collector who wants exactly that combination and can't find it new. Do you own any tank model? A discontinued quartz Cartier is one thing. The next watch stopped being manufactured before most of you were born, for a reason nobody could solve afterward, because the technology itself became obsolete. Before we move on to the next part, let me tell you this. Most people don't realize this, but buying a watch the wrong way can cost you thousands, and you won't even notice it until it's too late. That's why I created a complete insider guide to buying watches. The goal is simple. I'll help you stop guessing and start buying smart. You'll find the guide in the pinned comment and description. Now, let's move on to the next part. 6. The watch with no dial. In 1960, Bulova introduced a watch that had no dial, not a skeleton, not an exhibition caseback, an absence. Where the dial should have been, there was a circular window revealing the movement in full, a spinning index wheel with 300 tiny teeth, 2 coils of wire wound with 8,000 turns of 1/5 micron wire each, and a small Y-shaped tuning fork vibrating at 360 cycles per second. The Accutron Space View. And it moved like nothing before it. Every mechanical watch before 1960 ticked. The balance wheel oscillated in discrete steps, forward and back, creating that familiar rhythm. Max Hetzel, a Swiss engineer from the Federal Polytechnic in Zurich, whom Bulova recruited in 1948, figured out that a tuning fork could replace the balance wheel entirely. It vibrated at high enough frequency that the seconds hand moved in a completely smooth, continuous glide. No stepping, no ticking. A fluid sweep that looked, and still looks, nothing like a mechanical watch in motion. The accuracy was better than anything a consumer wristwatch had achieved, accurate to within 1 minute per month. Standard mechanical watches of the era varied by roughly 2 minutes per day. That's a 60 times improvement in real-world accuracy. NASA noticed immediately. Accutron movements went into the instrument panels of Mercury and Gemini capsules. Explorer 6 and Explorer 7, unmanned NASA orbiters launched in 1959, carried Accutron timing technology on board, not as a watch on a wrist, as an actual instrument in space. The Space View itself was a happy accident. When Bulova first demonstrated the movement to retailers in the late 50s, they used open-dial prototypes to show off the tuning fork vibrating. Retailers immediately asked whether they could buy that version. Bulova had never planned to sell it that way. But the demand was obvious, so they built it. The watch that exposed the movement was originally a sales tool. It became the defining object. Production ran until 1977, when quartz killed the commercial proposition for tuning fork technology. Not because quartz was more interesting or more beautiful, but because it was cheaper to produce and accurate enough for most buyers. The Space View died without ever being properly succeeded, because there's nothing to succeed it with. The technology is specific to the caliber 214 and its descendants. Those movements no longer exist in production. A Space View isn't just a discontinued model, it's the only surviving consumer product built around this specific approach to electronic timekeeping. I'll be honest, I find myself more drawn to the Space View than almost anything else on this list. There's something that doesn't quite resolve when you look at it. It shouldn't work as a dress watch. The open dial is too strange, too mechanical, too much like looking into an engine. And yet it does work somehow. That empty center creates a kind of tension. You keep expecting a dial. The absence is the point. Serviced examples in clean condition currently trade between $400 and $800, with the best original box pieces in the low 4 figures. For a piece of NASA-adjacent timekeeping history that is irreplaceable, not limited edition irreplaceable. Actually irreplaceable, because the underlying technology no longer exists anywhere in the world. Those numbers are still low. The index wheel alone, which has 300 teeth, each measuring 10 microns in depth, has accumulated more than 280 billion tooth engagements in a watch produced in 1965. Think about that for a moment. 280 billion, and people are still wearing them. There's a practical point worth making for anyone who owns a Space View or is considering one. The tuning fork movement requires specialized service. Most general watchmakers won't touch it. But the community of Accutron specialists is deep, surprisingly well documented, and parts for the caliber 214 are still sourced through dedicated channels. A watch this mechanically unusual has cultivated exactly the kind of devoted service community that keeps unusual things alive. The Space View owners who actually wear them regularly get them serviced every 8 to 10 years, pay typically between $200 and $400 for a proper service, and end up with a movement that performs to its original specification. That smooth sweep of the seconds hand, that hum you can feel against the wrist if you press lightly, returns exactly as designed. Have you ever experienced an Accutron? What the Space View never got was a documentary. The Speedmaster had the Moon. The Submariner had Bond. The Accutron had the actual space program, the actual instrument panels, the actual satellites. But nobody made the film, so most people still don't know the name. Bulova built something the world hasn't replaced. What comes next is a different kind of unrepeatable object. The man who designed it went on to create the two most valuable modern watches ever sold. And this one came first. 5. The gold watch that played by different rules. 1979. Palm Beach Polo World Cup. Every brand doing integrated sports watches was building in steel. Audemars Piguet, Patek Philippe. Gerald Genta's logic was steel, because steel meant durability meant sports credibility. Yves Piaget looked at all of that and ignored it completely. He built his entry in solid 1/8 karat gold, powered by the 7P caliber, then the flattest quartz movement in the world at 3.1 millimeters, and debuted it on the wrist of Bond girl Ursula Andress. He called it the Polo by Piaget, reference 7661 C701. He refused to call it a watch with a bracelet. He insisted it was a bracelet watch. The distinction mattered to him. The Gadroon motif was doing something structurally interesting. Those convex flutes ran the entire length of the bracelet, over the lugs, across the case, through every surface. You couldn't identify where the bracelet stopped and the case began because they'd been designed to be inseparable. Not just visually integrated, truly one object. A manufacturing decision that required Piaget to develop case and bracelet construction techniques that competitors hadn't attempted. The jet-set world bought it before the reviews came out. Andy Warhol wore the cushion variant. The round version became the collector's object of choice, rarer because fewer were made, counterintuitively. Both versions disappeared from regular production within a decade. The Polo line changed character multiple times after 1979. The original gold bracelet watch, specifically, was never directly remade. The number that should stop you is this. According to Piaget's own internal records, only around 10 mechanical versions of the 1979 Polo were ever officially registered in the brand's archives. The rest of the production run, roughly 95 to 98% of it, was quartz, which means the mechanical versions are near mythical, but the quartz versions aren't common either. The round 7,661 inches gold is rarer than the cushion square 7,131 despite lower prices, because the market has been slower to recognize it. In 2024, Piaget reissued the Polo 79 inches solid yellow gold to mark the brand's 150th anniversary. In 2025, the white gold reedition followed. The reissues drove the conversation back to the original, and the original started moving on the secondary market, with vintage Polo references now trading between $9,000 and $41,000, depending on materials and condition, per Watch Charts data from May 2026. The wide price range tells you something. The market is still calibrating. Collectors who know the Polo are buying. The people who inherited one from a parent or grandparent who lived large in the 80s mostly have no idea what they're holding. A gold integrated bracelet watch from 1979 with a movement record in Piaget's archive. Think about what it would cost to commission something equivalent from Piaget today. The 2024 reissue with the automatic movement started north of $35,000 at retail. The 1979 original in comparable condition can still be found below that. Piaget built the gold sports watch the world wasn't ready for. What comes next was designed by the same genius who built the Royal Oak. And this one came before it. 4. Gerald Genta's first great case. Before the Royal Oak, before the Nautilus, in 1964, Gerald Genta designed the C-shape case for Omega's Constellation collection. His first real architectural statement. A case where the lugs and body described a single, continuous flowing curve. The profile reading like two mirrored letters. Everything integrated, everything resolved. 8 years before the Royal Oak, 12 years before the Nautilus. When people name Genta's canon, the constellation C-shape rarely appears. It gets called a precursor, a warm-up, the thing he did before the famous things. That framing is suppressing the price. The C-shape constellation is, by any architectural measure, one of the most refined things Genta ever produced. And it trades on the secondary market at a fraction of what his later case designs command. Then, in 1976, same year as the Nautilus, Genta designed the IWC Ingenieur SL, a different vocabulary. Tonneau adjacent case, cushion shape, broad clean lugs, railroad track minutes around a white dial, and a magnetic shield built into the movement architecture that could resist magnetic fields up to 80,000 amperes per meter. That specification wasn't decorative. IWC built the Ingenieur SL for engineers and pilots working around industrial-strength magnetic equipment, MRI facilities, power station turbines, aircraft avionics bays. The movement was physically protected from interference that would stop a standard mechanical watch dead. Total production of the Ref. 1,832 Jumbo ran from 1976 to 1983. According to IWC's own records, just 598 examples were produced in those 7 years. The broader SL family across all variants ran through 2001, with the total output across those 2.5 decades estimated at fewer than 6,000 pieces across all sizes and references combined. That's it. There are no more being made, and never were. Chrono 24's 2025 market data recorded a 90.9% increase in demand for IWC Ingenieur references. That's demand, not price. The metric covers search activity, listing engagement, and buyer-to-seller ratio. The market is waking up to the Ingenieur as a Genta object, at a price point still accessible below the Royal Oak and Nautilus stratosphere. A steel SL in good condition currently trades between $6,000 and $12,000 on the secondary market. The Nautilus, which Genta designed the same year, trades at multiples of that in comparable condition. The design pedigree is identical in vintage. The year of creation is identical. The only difference is which watch a generation of collectors decided to romanticize through magazine covers and auction records. That decision is starting to be revisited. The 90.9% demand increase is the market saying so. If you inherited a watch with a cushion-shaped steel case and a railroad track dial from the 70s or 80s, have it checked. You might be holding an SL. The bracelet is usually the tell. Fine integrated links that look continuous with the case. The dial usually has no date window. The case back should show IWC's engraved movement architecture if you flip it, because the collectors who missed it at $6,000 are going to be looking for it at $12,000. The Ingenieur was built to survive magnetic interference. What comes next survived a different kind of interference, 60 years of being underestimated by almost everyone. 3. The watch that outsold the Datejust. In the early 60s, the Omega Constellation was outselling the Rolex Datejust. That's not a collector legend. In the Swiss export market during the late 50s and early 60s, the Constellation was the dominant luxury dress watch, the first Omega collection to carry chronometer certification as a standard rather than a premium, and the piece that established the brand's precision reputation internationally. It was known in certain circles simply as the Swiss watch, not a Swiss watch. The category had a winner, and this was it. Elvis Presley owned one. So did enough of the mid-century aspirational class that the pie pan dial became synonymous with a specific image of success. The pie pan designation comes from the dial's shape, a convex dome whose outer edge slopes upward in 12 faceted sections, catching and returning light at every angle of the wrist. It's a dial that photographs badly. The facets read as flat in an image. You have to see one in motion to understand what it does in changing light, why the collectors who own them describe the experience as irreproducible. The dial in its original form disappeared from regular production in 1968. The last true pie pan reference, made specifically for the Japanese market, went out in 1977. What replaced it was a series of excellent watches. The C-shaped Genta case, eventually the Manhattan Claws. But none of them had the pie pan dial. That geometry was gone. In March 2026, Omega launched the Constellation Observatory Collection. 9 modern references reviving the pie pan aesthetic, now driven by new master chronometer movements certified by Metas to resist magnetic fields up to 15,000 Gauss. The launch received sustained coverage from every major watch outlet. The conversation went back to the original. Per Watch Charts data to August 2025, the Omega Constellation 168.004 The steel pie pan reference with the hidden crown, most traded by collectors, gained 23.9% in value over the 12 preceding months. The broader Omega Constellation Index was down 4.5% over the same period. The pie pan outperformed its own collection by 28.3 percentage points, while the market was busy declining elsewhere. A stainless steel pie pan in good condition currently trades around $3,500. Full gold examples start around $7,000. These prices are still historically low for what the watch represents. The Constellation Pie Pan is Omega's foundational precision object, the chronometer that beat the Datejust on its home ground in the early 60s. By any logic of heritage value, it should trade closer to equivalent vintage Rolex or Patek references of the same era. It doesn't, because it hasn't had the visibility. The observatory launch changed that. Not overnight. But the buyers who read past the press release to the original watches are already moving. The people who bought the new observatory at Watches and Wonders 2026 spent north of $6,000 for a modern homage. The original is available on the secondary market for less than half that. And the original is the one that went to the moon in the instrument panels. Omega built the pie pan to prove a point about precision. What comes next was built by a brand that didn't need to prove anything about precision. It had been making movements since 1833, and the numbers show it. 2. The most underpriced Omega in the vintage market. There is a specific watch that working vintage Omega dealers describe as mispriced, not underrated. Mispriced. It costs less than it should, given what it is, and the gap between price and quality has been visible to people with access to the actual movements for decades. The broader collector community has been slower to arrive. The Omega Seamaster DeVille, reference 166 to 020. Don't confuse this with the modern Seamaster line. The 166 to 020 is a mid-60s dress watch. A slim, polished case, a sunburst dial, and a movement that received official chronometer certification and was finished to a level Omega reserved for its most precise production. The movement plates carry finishing you'd expect in a watch twice the price. The regulation screws on the balance wheel are polished individually. The rotor weight is chamfered. This was Omega being serious about movement quality in a way that doesn't show on the outside of the case. Dealers describe it this way: buy the case, get the movement for nothing. What that means is that if you extracted the caliber 564 from a 60s Seamaster DeVille and sold it as a standalone movement, it would fetch real money among movement collectors on its own merits. But the complete watch trades between $1,200 and $2,500 for clean, serviced examples. At that price point, you're acquiring a certified chronometer with hand-applied movement finishing for roughly what a modern mid-range watch costs. The OTT-UHR Guide, written by active working dealers in May 2026, described the Seamaster DeVille of this era as the single most undervalued watch in the entire vintage market. Not the most undervalued Omega. The most undervalued vintage watch, full stop. That's a claim worth taking seriously from people who trade these objects every week. So why is it mispriced? The name is the problem. Seamaster points collector interest toward diving watches, the 300, the Planet Ocean, the Ploprof. DeVille reads as a spin-off or a separate line. The 166 to 020 fell through the gap between two identities, and neither community claimed it. It's not the dive watch collectors romanticize, and it's not the constellation that watch historians study. It's the reference that lived between the famous ones, which is exactly why it's priced below its quality level 60 years after production. The pattern shows up across the vintage market. The watches most likely to be sitting unrecognized in a drawer are the ones with descriptive names that don't attach to a collector narrative. The DeVille is the clearest example I've found. Not because the watch is obscure or unusual, production numbers were solid, but because it never got a famous owner or a dramatic auction record or a dedicated online community to argue about its reference numbers for 20 years. That gap is closing, slowly, but it's closing. Something specific to understand about the caliber 564 inside the 166 to 020. This movement uses a free-sprung balance, meaning the regulator pin that almost every other vintage movement uses to adjust beat rate is absent. Instead, timing is adjusted by moving small weights around the balance rim. It's a more sophisticated and more stable approach. Free-sprung balances are significantly less susceptible to shock derangement, which means a well-maintained 564 keeps its regulation better over time than equivalent movements from competitors. Omega used this design because chronometer certification required it. The market hasn't priced that engineering distinction into the secondary value yet. You can find the 166-020 for under $2,000 from reputable secondary market dealers right now. A comparable Longines or Zenith movement watch with equivalent decoration and certification from the same period trades consistently higher, simply because those brands had better marketing in later decades. The DeVille had better engineering. It just didn't have the story. And watch markets run on stories until they run out of room, at which point they start running on engineering. The DeVille was hiding in plain sight for 6 decades. What comes next was hiding for a different reason entirely. And when collectors finally found it, the price jumped 68%. 1. The watch that went up 68% and nobody discussed it. Jaeger-LeCoultre, 2001. A rectangular steel case, 49 by 26 millimeters. 2 dials. Flip it. 1 face. Silver with small seconds at 6 o'clock. Flip the case on its carriage. The reverse. Gray dial. Second time zone. Same hand-wound caliber running both. The Reverso Duo Face, reference 270854. According to Chrono24's verified transaction data, this watch increased in value by 68.5% over the 5 years to mid-2025. New condition examples now trade at around $8,500, not a forum estimate or a Reddit valuation. Completed sales on the world's largest luxury watch marketplace, tracked across multiple years, showing consistent upward movement, 68.5%, on a rectangular steel watch that most people couldn't pick out of a display case without the label. The Reverso's origin story is worth knowing, because it explains why the flip case is more complex than it looks. The watch was designed in 1931 for polo players who needed to protect the dial during play. The mechanism that allows the case to pivot and rest face down on its carriage is far more complex than it looks. When Jaeger-LeCoultre decided to bring case production fully in-house in the early 1980s, they assigned engineer Daniel Wild to redesign the case to modern technical standards using CNC technology, a process that took 4 years. In 1985, Wild's case was unveiled. 55 components where the original had used 23, waterproof and dustproof for the first time, with a flip mechanism that could swivel at any point in the arc rather than requiring the case to be pushed to one end first. The Reverso you can buy today is Wild's case, not the 1931 original. He preserved the appearance almost perfectly while producing something mechanically superior. The Duo Face adds the second dial without adding a second movement. A single hand-wound caliber, the in-house JLC 854, displays 2 time zones by using both faces of the reversible case. Front dial for local time, reverse for home time. Flip the case, flip the time zone. The entire second time zone complication costs the watch no additional thickness beyond the base Reverso, because there's nowhere to hide the thickness anyway. Both displays share the same volume. This is not standard watchmaking logic. Standard watchmaking logic adds complications by adding movement layers. The Duo Face achieves the complication through case architecture instead. That's the observation collectors kept coming back to. The Duo Face isn't a complicated watch in the conventional sense. It's a watch with a philosophy about information. Show what's relevant. Hide what isn't. The wearer makes the decision by flipping the case. The watch doesn't present both time zones simultaneously and ask you to parse the display. It makes you choose. In 2025, Chrono24's annual report identified neo-vintage Jaeger-LeCoultre as one of the clearest demand growth signals of the year, particularly pieces from the early 2000s with established design language and service histories entering secondary circulation for the first time. The Reverso Duo Face Ref. 270854 sits at the front of that movement. Pre-2005. Steel. Mechanical, no battery, no circuit board, no digital interface. A service cycle of roughly 6 to 8 years for a clean caliber. It asks almost nothing of its owner beyond not polishing the case. Most people who own one bought it before 2015. It's probably being worn regularly, or it's in a drawer. Or it came from a parent who bought it in the mid-2000s and thought of it as a nice rectangular dress watch without any particular significance. It doesn't look expensive. The Art Deco geometry is restrained, almost quiet. The two dials in gray and silver don't demand attention. Nothing about the Reverso announces itself. It has been sitting in the watch world for 90-odd years, being periodically described as having its moment, and then fading back into polite collector interest rather than mainstream recognition. The 5-year appreciation number says the moment is now something different. That forward feint from the start of this video paid off. The forward feint was the pattern I mentioned at the beginning, about watches that nobody was discussing. The 270854 is the clearest single example. It appreciated by more than 2/3 in 5 years during a period when most of the watch market was correcting downward. It did this quietly, without auction fanfare, without a celebrity association, without a reissue driving demand for the original. The Reverso Duo Face simply kept getting harder to find in clean condition at accessible prices, because the people who owned good examples stopped selling them. That's the mechanism across every watch on this list. Not hype, not speculation. Supply contracting because the people who understand what they own decide not to let go of it. When supply contracts in that way, on a watch that the broader market hasn't priced correctly yet, the secondary market catches up in one of two ways. Gradually, over years, as new buyers discover the object, or suddenly, when a major publication or a high-profile sale puts the watch in front of an audience that didn't know it existed. Either way, the buyers who got in early don't regret it. The Ref. 270854 is now in that catching-up phase. It's not cheap anymore, but it's still findable. For how long is the question nobody can answer with confidence. The watches in this video don't share a brand or an era or a price point or a technology. What they share is simpler. The people who owned them were looking somewhere else. The market was looking somewhere else. The auction houses and the magazines and the forum threads were busy celebrating something louder. And while everyone was looking at the loud ones, these watches just kept becoming more valuable. The quiet ones always do, and they do it in a way that means by the time the market catches up, the best opportunities are already gone. The Tank Solo already moved. The Ingenieur SL is already moving. The Reverso Duo Face already moved. The ones still at the bottom of the list for most collectors? Check your drawer, because that's how it works every time. Not with drama, not with a press release. A watch that nobody wrote the article about sits in a box, changes hands a few times, starts showing up in dealer searches more often than it used to, and then one day the price is different from what it was 3 years ago, and everyone asks why they didn't notice sooner. They didn't notice because they were busy looking at the famous ones. You don't have to make that mistake twice.